Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Monteveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
Today we're going to be talking about the Cynic philosopher Crates. But before we jump into that, we've got a quick announcement.
So I just wanted to raise that I'm participating in an event. So just putting that on the radar for anyone listening if they want to come. So this is something for Evolve World Magazine. It's called Cultivating Wisdom and Virtue. How can the practice of Stoicism enrich our lives? That is, it's Friday, May 30th, 6 to 9 p.m. CET, which is a time zone in Germany. So it's 12 to 3 Eastern time. I'm leading it. So if you want to hear what I have to say, you don't get enough on the podcast and want to come hear some more discussion about Stoicism as a way of life. And then there's also something fun about this after that talk, this quick break, and then actually breakout groups and dialogue and discussion with other people that are attending. And then kind of everybody comes back together and talks about what they were talking about and the, really an opportunity to meet with other people interested in these kind of topics, discuss and connect with them. So there'll be a link to that in this episode, and would be lovely to see some people there.
Yeah, so check that out at evolve-world.com. So there's a list of programs. You should be able to find Michael's. And we have been asked, I should say, for more European-friendly events when you run events in the past. So for all of you Europeans out there,
now's your time.
Yeah, now's your chance.
Cancel your Friday plans.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about Crates, a Cynic philosopher, and he fits into the timeline of Stoicism. He's an interesting figure in itself, but he fits into the timeline of Stoicism because he was one of the teachers of Zeno. And we've sort of discussed this through line from Cynicism to Stoicism before. We had a discussion on Antisthenes, the first Cynic. That was episode 171. And he was a teacher of Diogenes. That's the famous Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynic who lived in a barrel. And Diogenes was the teacher of Crates. We covered Diogenes in that was episode 144. So then we have this sort of through line of Cynicism to Stoicism, and it's interesting to think about, how was Stoicism influenced by the Cynics, and also explore, the lives of the Cynics themselves and see, what's admirable, what's interesting, amusing about them.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's a great topic. This is the teacher of Zeno, founder of Stoicism. So, and we'll get into the biography in a bit, but Zeno is this non-philosophical character who's not living particularly philosophical, comes across Crates, kind of has his world rocked or his perspective shifted. And from that combination of Crates' cynicism and Zeno's own perspective, Stoic philosophy is born. And so great to go back. I don't know if it's the source. I think Zeno's probably the source, but certainly the inspiration for a lot of the Stoic ideas here.
Yeah, I think it's useful to think about Zeno as piecing together a lot of the different philosophical influences around at the time. And certainly Cynicism was one of the strongest. The classic story is that Zeno was shipwrecked. He goes to Athens, ends up in a bookseller's shop, and is reading the second book of Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is a Platonic dialogue, essentially. And then he asked, where can I find men like Socrates today? And Crates passes by at that very moment, and the bookseller says, follow him. And that's what Zeno does. And that sort of begins his philosophical quest, if you will.
We'll get into Crates' background in a bit. Just you've got Zeno. He's inspired by Socrates, but at this point, it's already 100 years later. Socrates isn't around anymore. So he's like, who are the followers of Socrates? Who can I learn from? And it's like that guy, Crates. That's your guy. And Zeno's like, great, I'm gonna go learn. And I think that, I mean, what's really cool about that story, I guess, too, is that explicit connection to Socrates as well, because he discovers cynicism as a way to follow Socrates.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, but perhaps, I mean, in some ways, Stoicism is best understood as a Socratic philosophy, but there are all
Mm-hmm.
these different framings on what Socrates meant, and the Cynics took some aspects of Socrates, while other schools, Aristotelians and such, took others, Platonists, of course. So, um, getting a grasp of the Cynic interpretation of Socrates can be a useful way to, see Stoicism, perhaps. Cool. So, just some basic facts about Crates. He was born 365 BC, died 285 BC, and apparently he came from a distinguished family, but upon witnessing a certain tragedy, according to Diogenes Laertius, he turns to Cynic philosophy, and that's perhaps through the influence of Antisthenes or Diogenes. And as a result, he decides to turn his property into money. Distinguished families, they mostly have their wealth and land and such. So he converts that into money. He gets liquid and then distributes that money to others. And of course, that's that turn to cynic minimalism. He is essentially giving up his wealth and decides to pursue the philosophy of Stoicism. So right there's an interesting parallel. And Zeno, he discovers philosophy when he's been shipwrecked, whereas Crates, out of some voluntary choice, decides to take up the cynic mantle, take up the cloak of a philosopher, and in part of that, live a life of, if not poverty, live a life of much less means than he was capable of.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a criticism of Stoicism, but I think there's something symbolic here of the Stoic. If you were going to criticize Stoicism as a cynic, you'd say the cynic is the person who proactively, gladfully gives up the indifference, and the Stoic is the person who kind of turns to Stoicism when they've lost all their stuff in a shipwreck, but they're very happy with the way their life was going before the shipwreck. I think there's something interesting there that, yeah, Crates obviously didn't have to do this, but he's like, it's that same. I mean, it is just that cynic idea about these things have a corrupting capability, right? It's why Diogenes lives in a barrel. There's actually something harmful about participating in the life of politics or possessions or wealth, where the Stoics don't feel that way. It's like easy come, easy go, preferable to have them, but you can still be happy if you get in a shipwreck and lose all your things. Crates is like, no, I'm actually going to sell my land. Where the Stoic would be like, I'm going to keep my land. I'm going to go study philosophy, but why would I give up my land? It's nice to have land. So yeah, I think a key difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have the example of Zeno, who turns to philosophy when he's forced to. Finds philosophy perhaps a source of resilience for that moment. And then, of course, on the other side, you have the story of Seneca. And Seneca is someone who says, live as if you had sold your property. Don't be attached to it. But of course, you don't need to, in fact, do that.
Yeah.
And
Seneca's like,
perhaps,
once every couple weeks, have plain breakfast, sleep on the floor, and then go back to your mansion. Um, I don't necessarily like, yeah, I don't, I think Seneca's got the right idea, but when you put on the cynic lens, you kind of laugh at it.
yeah. I also think the Senecan perspective is correct, but there is a way in which certainly there's a kind of criticism from the cynic that has its bite.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see a kind of egalitarianism too from Crates. He distributes the sum to his fellow citizens. But I saw there's another version of the story where it's also related that Diogenes persuaded Crates to give up his fields, so give up his land, and just throw all his money into the sea. There's a Diogenes perspective is that, if you really think that money's corrupting, then why are you giving it to others? There's also that thought.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, we'll just talk through some different stories from Crates' life. This, of course, comes from Diogenes Laertius' Lives of the Philosophers. very short chapter. You can check it out. It's one of the key sources for the biographical and doctrinal details of many ancient philosophers, especially some of these lesser known figures. And we'll talk through some of these stories, try to get a sense, as much as we can, of what kind of person Crates was, how he lived his philosophy, and then as we go through that, discussing connections and differences to Stoicism.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Let's do it.
Cool. So I just picked out a few stories that I thought were interesting, and one was, there's always this question, what's the point of studying philosopher? Or what's the point of studying philosophy? And Crates used to say that we should study philosophy to the point of seeing in generals nothing but donkey drivers, which is a great line, and I think a good way to capture this Cynic rejection of status. And it's also, of course, embodied in the story about Diogenes of Sinope, in his story when Alexander comes to see Diogenes, and Diogenes treats him with no deference whatsoever, simply tells him to, get out the way, stop blocking his son. And
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
like something I like about that too is that it's not an insult for the cynic. Like it's only an insult because of the general's ego. Like a cynic isn't mocking donkey drivers. Like, yeah, go ahead and command your donkey. That's fine. That's your business. It's only an insult to the ego of the general themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of takes the air out of any pretense a general might have had. And of course, a general has significant amount of status in the Greek city states, where the aristocratic classes are essentially warrior landowners. Um, I think that's also just a generally, cynicism has a kind of rejection of status, which is grounded in their larger rejection of convention as a whole, and that's something that sets it apart from Stoicism, perhaps. And I think there's a sense in which a Stoic could agree that you should see generals and donkey drivers as ultimately the same. But of course, the Stoics want to say we all have our roles. And in that sense, of course, a general and a donkey driver is not the same. They have different roles to play. Of course, they're all part of the, they're all our kin. They all they both possess reason. But nonetheless, they have different roles to play. And that might mean different forms of recognition or what have you. So there's a potential interesting tension there, or this might be a potential disagreement with the cynics. What do you think about that?
In terms of, so the view is that the Stoics, we've all got our roles, and there should be. Do you think the Stoics think there should be some roles that are better or more important than others? Like the general should be respected
Well,
because of what that position demands?
maybe a better way to put it is that the Stoic doesn't automatically throw out convention in the way a cynic does. And
No, no.
so they can see convention as, it's not perfect, but it often can be a guide for action. So I think that's sort of a general disagreement, and then there's a particular case of how do you treat people in different roles. And I think the Stoics probably would be closer to the cynic side than maybe, say, an ordinary
Hmm.
Athenian. They wouldn't want to give they wouldn't want to worship generals and such, but they still have this in the background. Convention can be a guide for action, and in some ways it's part of what goes into thinking about how to manage indifference well.
Yeah, I mean, another way of asking this question, I guess, is if Stoicism is a bit politically conservative, right? And that there was some sort of rule for this. I can't remember what it was, but there was some law, a way of
Chesterton's
saying this.
fence.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah. What was it?
Oh, Chesterton's fence.
Chesterton's fence. That's the exact thing. Maybe that was you that said that for the first time to me. But that kind of idea that the Stoics are like, look, if this is around for a while, it probably has some sort of function. We should at least default to considering what that function is. Yeah, I think that's probably the Stoic position. The Stoic is then going to be really radical of like, I've examined the fence. The fence is pointless. I will now no longer defend the fence. Like the Stoic is not going to support convention for the sake of convention, in my opinion. And they go, oh, but people are going to be upset with you if you don't support the fence, or people are going to think you're weird. The Stoics are not going to agree with that. But I do think they're going to default to, yeah, at least supposing these conventions. Basically, these conventions have value, so we want to check which ones are good and which ones are bad. Where the Cynics are, yeah, more skeptical holistically.
Yeah, I think that's right. The Stoic doesn't start from a place of skepticism, but that's also, of course, consistent with going against the crowd, of course, going
Yeah,
against convention
like if
when
you're,
when they've thought through the issues and made a judgment.
I've been reading some Epictetus, and he's really ripping into the people for caring about their fancy hairstyles or their, you know, um, the way that they, the way that they dress, or there's all these kinds of things that are, um, that's a social convention that carries with it these kind of social norms. But Epictetus has made a call of just like you're focusing on playing that game instead of becoming a good person, and that's just not a good thing. Um, yeah, so happy to criticize it once he's evaluated it for sure.
Absolutely. So, some other lines from Crates. Here's a nice line on flatterers. Those who live with flatterers he declared to be as defenseless as calves in the midst of wolves. For neither these nor those have any to protect them, but only such as plot against them. Probably there's a decent amount of agreement with Stoicism there. Be careful with simply seeking positive feedback, cultivating sycophantic behavior.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. Flattery is dangerous. Um, I guess this is like critical of like successful people again, right? Because it's like who lives with flatterers? Well, the general. Well, the Alexander the Great, like these kind of great people are the people that are surrounded by flatterers. So maybe that's where the bit of the punch is like, um, you're actually, you think you're this big strong person, but you're actually just kind of like a calf, like unprotected and weak, which is, I think a good point. Yeah,
Yeah, it does seem like one of these messages, be careful about flatterers, that is near universal, but is difficult to
because
internalize for people.
it feels so good to be flattered. Because I like to hear nice things about myself.
Crates also, he used to say it's impossible to find anybody wholly free from flaws, but just as in a pomegranate, one of the seeds is always going to be bad. I think that just the meaning of that is just that perfection is impossible. So you don't have that quest of sagehood, which is interesting. I don't know if that comes out into a comprehensive view for Crates, or if it's just a little bit of a heuristic, a rule of thumb. But perhaps that's another difference with at least some forms of Stoicism, where you're not thinking about aiming for perfection, aiming to be the sage.
I see, man. I see that connected. Yeah, you could read that in a strong way and say there's no sage, and maybe I think the Cynics probably believe that. I don't think Diogenes would be like, I'm without flaw. Doesn't seem very Diogenes-y, or neither would Socrates. But I see it also connected to that flattery line, right? You have these people who are like, I'm so great, I'm perfect, I'm amazing. And it just starts with this like, nobody's perfect. So like you've got problems. And if nobody's bringing up your problems, you're probably surrounded by a bunch of people who are like, not telling you how it is. Um, that's the connection I see.
Yeah, that's well put. We have a case on insults. Having exasperated the musician Nicodromos, he was struck by him on the face. So he stuck a plaster on his forehead with these words on it: Nicodromos' handiwork.
That's funny. Have you ever seen the Dave Chappelle skit? I don't know if this is dated at this point or what. Um, where he gets punched in the face. This is like, oh, do you know the one I'm talking about? The guy gets punched in the face, but he has like a bunch of rings on and leaves like an imprint in his forehead.
No, is that the one where being real goes wrong, or is it that one? Like
I
when you
might have to
shouldn't be
look it
so
up. I might
real?
have to look it up. We'll edit it in after. But that's what that reminds me of. It's like the humor is the same. I mean, that's funny, right? Like it's like it's the same kind of, that's a sense of humor. I actually really like that, where it's like, not taking yourself too seriously either, not being very prideful, walking around with a big note on your forehead. That's funny.
Yeah. Along the same lines, he would carry on a regular campaign of invective against the courtesans, habituating himself to meet their abuse. So these are just escorts, and I think that's a funny scene. Imagining Crates tossing insults towards these escorts, these courtesans, and then receiving it back as well.
He's like,
And
he wants to train himself in being insulted. So he goes in and finds these like really kind of tough, robust people and just criticizes them and insults them, and they just throw it back. And he's just like, this is my mental training.
yeah, this is my mental training. Seems like a bit of a rationalization. I think there's just some people who, enjoy that kind of conflict, enjoy these sorts of witticisms, I suppose.
Yeah.
Perhaps not so much connected to, but he married a Hipparchia, who was also a Athenian from, or we're not entirely sure if she's an Athenian, I suppose, but she was another Greek from a noble family. So of course her family would disapprove of a marriage to Crates, who took up the life of a poor philosopher. And she was also a Cynic philosopher, probably deserves another episode in her own right. But he married her, would keep her would interact with her in public. And there's outrageous stories about them fornicating in public, which may or may not be true. But the main fact that he would interact with a high class woman in public would have actually been against Athenian society in and of itself, just because higher class women were secluded in Athenian society at that time. And I think generally throughout the history of Athens, please, if there are any classicists in the audience, please correct me if that's mistaken. But Athenian society was actually one of the more restrictive of the Greek societies for higher class women. So I think that's there. You see also this other rejection of convention, but I think that's just fits in Cynic, the general theme of cynicism, and perhaps some of these more egalitarian themes as well. Not seeing there being a large difference between the donkey driver and the general, there being a large difference between a man and a woman.
Yeah. So there's a certain leeway these crazy old philosophers get in Athens. By this point, you've already had Diogenes, you had Socrates before him, but then you have a woman, Hipparchia, doing this, which was just another level of kind of rejection of norms above and beyond seeing a man. It's just like, it's one thing to see Crates doing this, but now his wife is out there, and his like wife from a famous family, doing the same kind of stuff. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I think there's this whole tradition about writing sort of these outrageous stories about the Cynics. So uh, I wouldn't put too much stock in some of these, but I do think the general theme, there's a source for these stories, and there's a reason why the Cynics, became the subject of these stories, and that is because of I think, their outsider status, their almost perhaps comic type status in Athenian society. both rejecting norms and then, of course, just making fun of people taking I think it's a great example, perhaps, of the use of humor in philosophy, the use of skits, even to show philosophical truths, if you will.
Yeah, I mean it's great. I think it's cool.
Yeah, it's a common through line between the Cynics. You have, of course, all these stories about Diogenes living in a barrel, masturbating in public, sticking his nose up at Alexander. Antisthenes, he's the first one, he's the moderate one, but he himself is, of course, as we covered, also has all these outrageous behaviors, also embraces the
Yeah, and you
minimalist lifestyle.
add to that list Crates throwing his money in the ocean, selling all his land and throwing his money in the ocean, or just like having sex in public with his wife, which are just like, yeah, I mean, just the most radical things people could think of. Um, so yeah, this is what they're constantly being accused of. Are you saying here, Caleb, to take it kind of with a grain of salt, or is the view here that the Cynics did this stuff and they did it as kind of performance art, or that's just how they were, or they were being lied about after?
Oh, maybe there's just some amount of embellishment. I don't know if maybe I don't think they're being lied about, but maybe there's some amount of embellishment about some of their deeds. Well, maybe another way to put it is, uh, maybe there's some amount of embellishment. The general theme that comes through, I think, must have been grounded in reality in some way. There's a reason people chose the Cynics for these kinds of stories, even if you are skeptical about, did they actually do these things? I think in some sense they must have rejected material goods. I mean, certainly that's true. They must have rejected some amount of sexual norms, some amount of norms between how men and women interact. I mean, that must be true.
Yeah, just some of them maybe get twisted a little bit. But I guess the point here is we don't really have that from the Stoics or from the Cynics. People aren't like political enemies of Diogenes making things up. But maybe adding a little bit more, juice to the story to make it a little bit more shocking, a little bit funnier.
One other line from this actually comes from Plutarch. Um, he said that Crates, with only his wallet and tattered cloak, laughed out his life jocosely, that's with joy, as if he had always been at a festival, which is, I think, a good, nice way to see someone as a, he's a cynic. He's doing some of these outrageous things, having fun while doing it, having fun while teaching philosophy, while getting, plastered by Nicodromos, and so on. So I think and I think that's a general sense you get from the Cynics. Diogenes, bit of a rascal, but having fun nonetheless. And perhaps that's something to emulate, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. That's kind of the Stoic side of the fork. I was looking up the contemporary definition for cynic because I just think this ancient one so often, and it's at least according to Google right now, it's a person who believes that people are motivated purely by self-interest rather than acting honorably or for honorable or unselfish reasons. And so that contemporary sense is just everybody's kind of a jerk. They're kind of in it for themselves. They're hypocritical if they pretend they're not in it for themselves. They act like they're altruistic. They're lying. That's kind of a sad way to be. Obviously, any sort of contemporary definition loses some of the nuance, but think about how different that is than the person who is, laughing, having fun. Sounds like they're always at a festival, but they've just got a cloak. They just got some tattered rags, but they're still having a good time. That is kind of a fun. That's a fun way to think about Stoicism or Cynicism. Excuse me. It loses some of the cutting aspect of it. Like I do think the Cynics deserve that reputation. Maybe for not people
Mm-hmm.
are acting in self-interest, but they're acting out of convention. They're not acting authentically. But that idea of joy is not something we think of in Cynicism today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in the Cynics, you see a kind of version of hardcore Stoicism. Perhaps we've talked about this before, but you see that this emphasis on loving the philosophical life, rejecting anything that is irrelevant to that project, especially material goods, a kind of prescriptive minimalism, this idea that you should reject wealth that you don't see in the Stoics, except for perhaps Musonius Rufus has a little bit of that. And because there's this skepticism about so many, about the status quo, um, there's a lot more possibility for actions and just interacting with people as people. So, of course, the Cynics rejected norms between men and women and also between other city states. You know, they were cosmopolitan, citizen of the cosmos, not didn't see themselves necessarily as Athenians, but were playing more of an outsider role. And these are ideas that certainly influenced Stoicism, that of course influenced Stoicism quite strongly. So that's maybe why it's useful to frame as a hardcore version of Stoicism with, of course, some different theoretical differences, but there's a reason why Epictetus saw the Cynics as admirable nonetheless.
I mean, I really love that idea that you raised about talking to people as people. I think that's one thing. I think Stoicism, we talked about this before. Cynicism is a bit too hardcore for me. I don't think it's something I aspire to holistically, the same way I might aspire to the Stoic sage holistically. But that idea that the kind of person that can meet Alexander the Great as a citizen of the cosmos and as an equal, the kind of person that can laugh with just your cloak. There's some cool stuff that I take from it. And so the same as Epictetus, I see that it's admirable, but Epictetus really put it on a pedestal, right? Like some of the Stoics really thought it was for the special few, as Epictetus would put it. I don't think I necessarily agree with that. I'm not sure if it's a better life than Stoicism. Well, I don't think it is, but parts of it really do appeal to me. Especially as you said, that egalitarian part. That's something in Stoicism that appeals to me. But just treating people as people, generals the same as donkey drivers.
Absolutely. Cool. Do you have any other words as by way of conclusion, or do you want to touch on any other stories or lines I didn't pick out?
I mean, the other thought I have about cynicism more generally is maybe the benefit of the rejection of convention is this kind of position of this skeptical starting position, of like what is value, what matters in life. I think one of the difficulties about Stoicism, putting Stoicism into practice, is that you're expected to both act pretty similarly in terms of indifference as everybody else does, but then have a very different internal life. Like you're supposed to pursue your career, possessions, a good reputation in the community, a good job. And different people, maybe you're pursuing a different life and you shouldn't, but many Stoics will continue to live these kind of normal looking lives, and that's consistent with Stoicism. But then we're supposed to have this like internal transformation without this external transformation. I think in some ways there's this appeal. Epictetus talks about, throw out these ideas of good and bad, start from zero, because if you try to hold on to them, it's going to be too confusing. And I think there's that kind of ideal in cynicism where they reject everything. And then I like the Stoic proposition, and maybe this is what Zeno did. It's like, okay, we start by rejecting everything, and then we build back in from first principles. Okay, well, virtue is good. Okay, possessions are preferred in difference. So we kind of build that life back up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in practice, it can be hard as a Stoic to, be like, well, my life's going to look pretty similar, but now I'm just not supposed to care about this because it's indifferent or it's not up to me or something like that. Whereas at least the Cynic is like, no, like I spit on social convention or, I'm going to pee in the street because what people think of me doesn't matter. Now I wonder if you thought about like a Stoic training program in a vacuum, like maybe a Plato's Republic, if you would have people be cynical for a period of time and then kind of reintroduce them. I don't know. I don't know if that would work, but it seems almost hard for me to become a Stoic while integrated into society, but Stoicism asks you to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. As a Stoic, you're supposed to live the life of a citizen, live in the city without, in a sense, being of the city. Keeping your internal life separate and really living a radical philosophy without perhaps that being the radical life that someone who's extreme as a cynic would lead. And there's that risk that just by living normally, externally, that begins to impact and influence the internal world as well, right? So, and I think that perhaps that's what you're pointing at. Is there's that risk of, I guess the Stoics would really just say contamination almost, but probably also there's this other problem of how do you know what the right thing to do is? How do you know which conventions should be followed, which should be rejected? Of course, which is a large question. But in response to that first problem, I think what you're saying makes sense, and it might be suggesting that you should live as a cynic for a bit. That's why Seneca suggests, going without for a week, or essentially living as a cynic in order to maybe not just you can test yourself, but also see how should you live.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just agree. I agree. I think, I mean, this comes back to Masonius Rufus. I mean, basically what we're talking about is there educational benefit for living pretty radically at certain points in time? I think Masonius Rufus and Epictetus would say yes. I think it's a spectrum. Seneca might dial it down to just a week, but the Stoics seem to agree there is a benefit to doing that. And I just think it might be a bit easier. When we see this in kids nowadays too, right? Like people are more radical when they're younger often, and then some mellow out, many mellow out, not everybody, but many kind of, I would say, maybe become a little bit more less extreme in their views. So I wonder if there's this benefit. Certainly, I think the Stoic would look at somebody who was cynical at 17 and say, "Oh, you're going to be a lot more likely to become a good Stoic than somebody who was maybe Epicurean at 17." And they'd say, you don't quite have it right. You got a bit too far, but this is a much better material to work with.
Yeah, well, I think I like the idea of seeing where you can be cynical and perhaps using that as a tool of development or part of a practice as a way to be more Stoic. I think that's certainly a fruitful thing to do, and that's that's why Musonius Rufus, Epictetus, and Seneca proposed that kind of thing.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Awesome. Well, there's one interesting line that it might be worth leaving with from Crates. Something worth thinking about. Crates says that what he has gained from philosophy is a quart of lupins and to care for no one. All right. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.